Welcome to Keto Life Support, where we make your keto life sustainable, fun, and low stress. I'm Kim Howerton, and I'll be coming to you weekly with some of my keto besties to bring you the practical, real-world keto advice that you need. Quick disclaimer, I am not a doctor, and even if we do have a doctor in the house from time to time, he or she is not your doctor, and nothing we say on this show should be taken as medical advice. Always check in with a trusted medical professional about your own personal medical concerns. Hello and welcome to Keto Life Support. This is Kim Howerton, and we are here to listen to episode 52. Okay, so I'm excited to talk about a topic today that has been using up really like all of my free time. So we're going to discuss blood sugar testing a little bit today. This is going to be a multi-episode topic because I'm doing things over time and I want to give you some insight. And I'm also going to have an online free class on the topic. So if you want information on that class, there will be a link in the show notes where you can go and sign up to hear from me about this class. You can look for that anywhere you're listening to this podcast. So, for years, I've been doing blood sugar testing with a Abbott Freestyle Libre continuous glucose monitor. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with continuous glucose monitoring, primarily the original market for continuous glucose monitors were diabetics, especially type 1 diabetics who are at grave risk of blood sugar fluctuations and need to be monitored, kind of all the time, hence the need for continuous glucose monitoring. Unfortunately, not all type 1s have these devices, but they do exist. So it's like a little patch that gets stuck on your skin and it has a teeny little needle in it that you can't feel, and it's able to sample the fluid that's under your skin. It's interstitial fluid, but interstitial fluid will track with blood glucose, so you can get an approximation of what your blood glucose is doing through a continuous glucose monitoring device. So the two main devices on the market in the United States anyway are the Abbott Freestyle Libre and the Dexcom. I think we're on the G6. The 7 may come out at some point, but the Dexcom and the Abbott are the two main brands. I'm hearing that there are some more in development, but those are the biggies. The Dexcom, from what I understand, is actually kind of the better device in that it's a little more accurate. The Abbott, slightly less accurate, but much more widely available. And it's also a lot less expensive. And so I have the Abbott because champagne dreams. What is that? Champagne dreams and beer budget. The Dexcom is a little out of my price range, especially because I pay out of pocket because I'm not a diabetic and it's not a medical device that I require for my health. And so my medical insurance does not think experiments for keto products is a insurable coverage. So sad. So let's just kind of do a little overview of what the deal is with these blood glucose monitors. So you probably know, hopefully, that you can get a glucometer, which is a blood glucose testing kit, at really almost any drugstore. And it's the kind that does a little finger prick. So you prick your finger, you squeeze a little drop of blood, and then with a little tester strip and the device, you can check that blood sample and it'll give you an approximation of your blood glucose. So what's the difference? Well, really the only difference with using a continuous glucose monitor versus pricking your finger in terms of ease and convenience, right, is that I don't have to prick my finger so constantly. If I were trying to really track what my blood glucose is doing after eating, I would need to prick my finger, very, very often to get a curve of understanding, when did it go up? How much did it go up? When did it start coming down? Like getting a really accurate read on that. But if you don't have access to a continuous glucose monitor, you can absolutely check your blood glucose. What you do is you'd test your blood glucose right before you ate a meal by a finger prick test. You would take note of that number. You would eat the meal. Now, you don't want to stretch this meal out forever if you're trying to, do a concise test. But, eat your meal. Don't scarf it down. Just eat a normal meal. Then you would test again at the 30-minute mark. Then you test at the 60-minute mark. Then you test at the 90-minute mark. And if you don't see your blood sugar staying settled for the last two tests, you would test again. What you're looking for, essentially looks like either a flat line or a little bit of a bell curve. You want the first measurement to be matched by the last or the last two measurements. If it goes up, you want it to come down. Hopefully that was clear. So say you tested right before you ate and your blood glucose was 90. And then 30 minutes after eating, it was 100, right? It only went up 10 points. That's a very small rise. And then you tested again at 60 minutes and you expected it to be down to about 90, but it's now 120. So that was like a slower rise and it's still up. So now it's 120. And now you test again at the 30 minutes later than that. And now it's starting to come down and now it's down to 100. Okay, I'm going to test again 30 minutes later. Okay, now it's down to 90 and it's settled there. So, you're watching the curve and how long it's up and how much it comes down. Now, one thing I do want to say is if you test at the 30-minute mark and you're like, oh, it's still 90. One thing I want to caution you is some foods rise quickly and some foods rise slowly. So I would still do a test at that hour mark to make sure it's still down around 90. Now, one thing I also want to say is that all of these glucose monitors, the CGMs and the finger prick tests, they have a margin of error. So what does that mean? It means that as they can only be so accurate. So the general error rate on these things is 20%. 20%, which means that if you tested your glucose and it said it was 100, it would still be considered quote unquote accurate. It's within its tolerance range. If your actual blood glucose was anywhere between 80 and 120, 20% on either side, right? So you've got to know that there's a little bit of wiggle in here. And so that is something I want to caution you about. Don't get bogged down in small fluctuations, right? If you're like, well, I tested before I ate and it was 90 and I tested later and it was 92. And so it's still elevated. Now you cannot know that there's a difference between 90 and 92. And so now at this point, you might be saying, well, why am I even going to bother if there's that large a variance? That's crazy. I do find in general, they're not the full 20% off as far as I can tell. But without going to a blood lab, say, a Quest or wherever, where they can take a blood sample and give you a more accurate glucose than that, you're just going to have to know that you can't worry about small differences and small fluctuations. Now, the last time I checked into it, there are a few glucose monitors like the one by the Keto Mojo who keeps to a tighter tolerance. For them, I think it's if your glucose is under 100 milligrams per deciliter, they're saying their meter is accurate within 5 points. So that's more accurate than you'd find in the tolerance levels of other meters. Now, again, I'm not saying those meters are swinging 20% on every reading rather. I've done various calibrations where I've checked between different meters and they've come in relatively similar. I just don't want you to get bogged down in the difference between, well, this meter says 95 and this meter says 90. And I checked it again and I have just stabbed my finger 7 times in a row trying, there is a little bit of variance. You can get something called calibration fluid if you're ever concerned. It's a little fluid, that you'd put on the glucose dropper, the tester strip. And this fluid is set at a certain reading, right? So you can see like if the fluid says it's supposed to be X, is my meter also reading X? And that way you can calibrate if your meter seems to be accurate. So that's something, if you're a worrier, that's something good to do. There are definitely variances with CGMs that seem to be even more noticeable than with finger prick testing. That's why earlier I said the Dexcom seems to be more accurate than the Abbott. What I hear from other people and see is the Abbott oftentimes will have what I call a degree of variance off from the glucose monitor, the finger prick test kind, but it's actually fairly stable, which is, let me explain what that means. So when I test the blood directly in my finger prick testing, I think I might win a contest to say prick the most number of times in a podcast, by the way. But when I do the finger testing and then I compare it to what my CGM reads, what I see is the CGM is telling me my blood glucose is averaging about 10 points lower than the finger prick. So on my CGM, I average around 75, but on my finger testing, I average around 85. So I just know that. And I do a lot of cross-checking because I want to be as close to accurate as I can. And so I will see that repeatedly, that, my CGM says I'm 80 and my glucose on my finger says that I'm 90, but it's within, 10 to 12 points. And I do that every new sensor. So the sensors on the CGMs, they only last about 14 days. And so you have to put a new one on every 14-ish days or however, long you want to wear it and test. And so every time I get a new one, I test a lot at the beginning and then I spot check throughout because I've had some sensors a few times, not very often, but I've had a few Abbott sensors where I'm like, this is just wildly off. Like it wasn't a trustable trend. Like it would say I was 65 when my finger said I was 100. And then it said on the CGM that I was 100 when my finger said I was 80. I'm like, I cannot chart a graph from this. And so I'm like, that seems to be a faulty sensor. That's only happened to me, I believe once. It might have been twice, but it's very rare. And I've been doing this for several years, but it does happen. And then other times, like the last couple of days of the sensor, it seems a little less accurate. And so I always want to cross-check that. That being said, I'm within blood sugar ranges that I'm never worried about, unless I'm testing some crazy product. But like the way that I live, my blood glucose is very stable in a very healthy range. So for me, it's really more curiosity that I'm looking at. But I do see people on ketogenic diets or low carb diets that are kind of what might be termed like a biohacker. And they're trying to test the difference between, why is my blood glucose 80 here and 82 here and 93 here, like very small margins. And in my opinion, now again, I have not extensively used a Dexcom, but I think just based on science, I don't know that you can really dial it in that tightly. We can see swings. We can't see little teeny fluctuations accurately. So I just want to warn people, if they think that they're going to get like highly accurate to the teeniest degree data from wearing a CGM, that's not generally what I find to be the case. That being said, they can be super helpful if you still have fairly swinging blood sugars and you want to know, like, what might be behind the reason that my blood sugar is up above 100 most of the time. Can I see some patterns? So if you have broader data, which you'll get from a CGM, right? You don't have to remember to prick your finger constantly. And you don't get the calluses. You can be like, that's interesting. When I drive, my blood sugar seems to be higher. When I take a shower, my blood sugar is higher. When I exercise, my blood sugar is higher. So it can be super duper helpful for trends. One thing I do want to bring up again, this episode, I'm really talking about like caveats and little details that you should know if you are curious about using a CGM. I will in future episodes and in that class get into details around foods that I've tested and the effects of those foods. But this is kind of an overview of using a CGM. So remember earlier I mentioned that it's testing interstitial fluid, not directly your blood glucose, but they track together. There is a time delay. So one of the things you'll find is if you're doing the finger testing, you might eat a food and then see your blood sugar shift pretty much right away or within a couple of minutes or, within a smaller time frame. There's a time delay with the CGM so that you might not see that shift for 15 minutes. The shift was happening to your blood glucose faster, but it took longer to reach the CGM. I used to think that it was the interstitial fluid tracks slower. I've recently been reading that it's actually that there's a little bit of encapsulation around the needle on the CGM that delays the time. That is for the scientists to know. I don't think it actually matters to you guys, but you won't see an immediate effect with a CGM. Everything is slightly delayed, which can make it challenging to calibrate your CGM, to try and make sure it's accurate with the finger pricks because there's that time difference. So, you do have to just be aware that there's going to be a little bit of a shift of time. So those are the details you probably need to know about getting a CGM, except for these. In the United States, to obtain a CGM, you need a doctor's prescription. This is true in every state of the United States. So if you're someone who is not working with a doctor who is on board with your desire to test your blood sugar with a CGM, and they won't give you a prescription for it, you're going to need to use a service. So there are services in the United States where you can sign up for the service and they assign you a doctor who prescribes you a CGM. So they're not getting around the rule. You still get a prescription. It's just that you get the prescription through their service. These services will cost more money because obviously you're paying for the service. They're still having to pay the doctor. So all these things are happening. Some of these companies, there's one called Levels. There's one called Nutrisense. I will put some links. I'm not affiliated with any of these companies at the time of the recording of this podcast. I can't guarantee that I wouldn't say yes. I would probably say yes if one of these companies sent me some free stuff and to test it out and try it. But at the time of this recording, I'm not using any of these companies directly. So if you get a prescription from your doctor, you take that prescription to the pharmacy and you get your sensors. Now, with the Abbott, and I believe this is true of the Dexcom, but I don't know personally, if you have a fairly new cell phone, there are apps for these meters to be read on. So I read my sensor on my phone on an app. I did not have to get a separate reader. However, you can get a separate reader that you can test that with. But if you don't want to pay for the reader, you can make sure that your phone will work. Retail, the sensors for the Abbott run around $60 for a 14-day sensor. So that would be about $120 if I'm paying full price for a month-ish supply. That being said, I do seem to find very, very often when I go to my pharmacy, I usually go to CVS, they have a coupon in their system. So I will often pay less than the full $120 for a 28-day supply. I think last time I ended up paying closer to $50 for the 28 days. So it can really fluctuate, but I always walk in there prepared to pay up to that $120. As I said, if you're using one of the services, be prepared to pay more. Often, though, these services do come with something like a coach who helps talk you through questions you might have about your blood sugar. And so you might find that useful potentially. So just so you know that that exists. So that was just a little overview of what a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, can do for you, how they work, how you obtain one. I will in future episodes be going over some of the results of my tests. The reason I put together what will be a future class as well is there are visuals, and podcasts are not the best place for visuals. So you can see the various graphs in that class. So again, we'll put a link in the show notes that you can get on a list where I will let you know when that class is available, because I want to pull together a lot of data that I'm still testing so that you get the most out of it. So look forward to more discussions of blood sugar and blood sugar testing. If you have questions and if you have products that you want me to test, people, it's getting expensive, but I do have some openings where I can test certain products. And so if you have requests about that, please get in touch with me through my Facebook group Keto Life Support. We're on Facebook. And if you're looking for a link to that, ketolifesupport.com is the website where you can grab a link to the Facebook group. All right, guys, I hope you have a great week and look forward to more blood sugar testing with me. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Keto Life Support. Want more information? Want show notes? Want to suggest a topic? Just head over to ketolifesupport.com. That's where all that kind of thing can go on. By the way, I have a request. If you could go to your podcast host and hit subscribe, we would really, really appreciate it. And what would be even more awesome is if you could write a review. And what would be even more awesome than that is if you could write like a really flattering review. Just asking, you do you. All right. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm thrilled that you're part of the Keto fam. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.